Have you ever felt invisible? Like a ghost haunting the edges of a life you once knew? For Alara Vance, this wasn't just a feeling. It was her reality. Once the brilliant mind behind a tech empire, she was now clutching a cheap sponge, her reflection warped in the polished marble floor of a billionaire's penthouse. Tonight she was just the help paid to erase smudges and disappear. But in a room dripping with diamonds and deceit, one man was about to see her for who she truly was. She came to clean his tables, but she was about to be crowned. This is the story of how a single sentence, a shocking public declaration, can shatter a life of lies and build a new kingdom from the ashes. The scent of money was something Alara Vance had never forgotten. It wasn't the crisp, papery smell of cash, but something far more complex and insidious. It was the fragrance of bespoke leather from a $1,000 armchair, the subtle citrusy notes of a rare floor polish that cost more per ounce than gold, and the aerosonic perfume of filtered air circulating through a space so vast and empty it felt like a cathedral to wealth. Tonight it was the smell of Damian Blackwood's Manhattan penthouse, and it was suffocating her. Her uniform, a drab, ill-fitting gray polo shirt and black slacks provided by five-star event services, felt like a costume for a role she never wanted. The fabric was starchy and cheap, a constant chafing reminder of her fall from grace. Just 2 years ago, she would have been a guest at a party like this. She would have worn a custom-made gown, perhaps a deep sapphire silk that matched her eyes with diamonds at her throat that weren't borrowed. Her husband Richard Thorne would have been at her side, his hand possessively on her back, a Rolex on his wrist, glinting under the chandeliers. They were a power couple, the darlings of the tech world, their future as bright and blinding as a camera flash. Now her only accessory was a plastic spray bottle filled with glass cleaner, and the only hand on her was the metaphorical one of fate crushing her windpipe. Vance, the West Terrace windows. I want them so clean the birds get confused. Mr. Blackwood is obsessive about streaks, barked Maria, her shift supervisor. Maria was a woman whose face seemed permanently set in a scowl of disappointment. She didn't care that Alara had a master's degree in software architecture, or that she once designed algorithms that were now running half the financial world. To Maria, Alara was just another warm body, a pair of hands to scrub and wipe until they were raw. Yes, Maria, Alara said, her voice a monotone whisper. She grabbed her cleaning caddy, the squeak of its cheap plastic wheels an obscenity on the hand-laid Italian marble. The West Terrace was a marvel of engineering and opulence. It overlooked Central Park, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. A glass balustrade ensured an uninterrupted view. It was a view Alara and Richard once dreamed of from their cramped startup office, fueled by cheap coffee and the fierce, burning ambition of her mind. He was the salesman, the face. She was the engine, the architect. She wrote the code, the revolutionary predictive algorithm she'd christened Project Chimera, while he charmed the investors. A bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. He charmed them, and then he left her. The divorce had been a surgical strike. Richard, with his team of shark-like lawyers funded by his new wealthy fiancée, had painted Alara as unstable, incompetent, and greedy. He'd claimed Project Chimera was his brainchild, that she was merely an assistant. He'd produced falsified documents, paid off a former colleague to lie under oath, and stripped her of everything: her intellectual property, her savings, her reputation. He even took the dog. He left her with a mountain of legal debt and a name so thoroughly smeared in their industry that no tech firm would touch her. So she did what she had to do to survive. She sold her car, her mother's jewelry, and finally her pride. She took jobs that paid cash under the table, walking dogs, stocking shelves, and now cleaning the homes of people who wouldn't even register her existence. As she sprayed the glass, her reflection stared back, a pale, haunted version of the woman she used to be. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe, functional ponytail. The spark in her sapphire eyes had been replaced by a weary exhaustion. She was 29, but she felt ancient. This job was supposed to be a big one. Damian Blackwood was a legend, a specter in the business world. He was a self-made billionaire who had appeared on the cover of Forbes and Wired, celebrated for the meteoric rise of his company Blackwood Industries. He was notoriously private, a man who valued precision and perfection above all else. His parties were the stuff of legend, and his penthouse was considered the crown jewel of Manhattan real estate. Cleaning it before a major event paid 3 times the normal rate. It was enough to cover her rent for the next 2 months and maybe, just maybe, buy some groceries that weren't from the discount bin. She worked meticulously, her mind drifting into the familiar, comforting logic of her past work. She treated the window like a line of code, searching for bugs, the smudges and streaks, and methodically debugging them with her squeegee. It was a pathetic parallel, but it was all she had left. The first guests would be arriving in an hour. The catering staff was already arranging champagne flutes into gleaming pyramids. A string quartet was tuning their instruments in the grand ballroom. The air was thick with anticipation, a vibrant energy that felt alien to her. She was a ghost in this machine of celebration, her only purpose to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection. Finishing the final pane of glass, she stepped back to admire her work. The view was breathtakingly, painfully beautiful. It was the view from the top of the world, a world that had chewed her up and spat her out. For a fleeting, dangerous moment, she allowed herself to feel the full, crushing weight of her loss. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a salty streak on her own face that she couldn't just wipe away. She quickly brushed it aside. Ghosts weren't allowed to cry. They were supposed to be invisible. As the sun bled out over the horizon, casting the city in hues of orange and violet, the guests began to arrive. They flowed into the penthouse like a river of silk and diamonds, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Alara, now assigned to discreetly clear empty glasses and plates, moved along the edges of the rooms, her head, down her movements practiced and silent. She had mastered the art of being unseen, of becoming part of the furniture. She saw faces she recognized from society pages and business journals. There was Senator Franklin holding court by the fireplace. There was Isabella Monet, the supermodel, looking ethereal in a silver gown. And there was the host himself, Damian Blackwood. He wasn't what she expected. The paparazzi photos portrayed him as severe and imposing. In person, he was quieter, radiating an intensity that was more magnetic than intimidating. He stood near the entrance, dressed in a perfectly tailored Tom Ford suit, his dark hair slightly unruly, his gray eyes scanning the room with a startling intelligence. He wasn't working the crowd in the traditional sense. He was observing it like a grandmaster studying a chessboard. For a brief second, his gaze swept over her, and Alara felt a strange jolt, as if he'd seen right through her invisibility cloak. But then he moved on, his attention captured by a new arrival, and she was just a cleaner again. She focused on her task, her tray filling with half-empty champagne flutes stained with expensive lipstick. She navigated the clusters of chattering guests, their conversations a meaningless buzz in her ears. They talked of stock markets, of summering in the Hamptons, of art auctions at Sotheby's. It was the language of her former life, and hearing it now felt like listening to a foreign tongue she'd once spoken fluently. And then she heard a laugh. It was a laugh she would recognize anywhere, a sound that was etched into her memory like a scar. It was smooth, confident, and utterly false. Her blood ran cold. She froze behind a large marble pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs. She risked a glance. There he was, Richard Thorne. He looked exactly the same, yet different. His tailored suit was more expensive, his smile more practiced, his aura of success more suffocating, and on his arm, dripping in emeralds that perfectly matched her vapid eyes, was Veronica Sterling Thorne, his wife. The heiress whose money had funded his legal war against Alara and launched his new company, Thorne Innovations. Alara felt the air leave her lungs. Of all the parties in all of New York City, he had to be here. A wave of nausea washed over her. She wanted to run, to disappear, to melt into the floor. But she was trapped, an animal caught in the headlights. Richard was holding a glass of scotch, schmoozing with a group of investors. "The key is disruption," he was saying, his voice full of that false, charming authority. "You can't be afraid to break things to build something better. Ilara wanted to scream. He hadn't built anything. He had stolen. He was a parasite who had latched onto her brilliance and drained it dry. Veronica's sharp, unpleasant voice cut through the air. "Oh, Richie, darling, don't bore them with work talk. Tell them about the new yacht." She looked around, her gaze sweeping the room with an air of ownership, and then her eyes landed on Ilara. There was a flicker of recognition followed by a slow, cruel smile that spread across her perfectly made-up face. She nudged Richard and tilted her head in Ilara's direction. Richard followed her gaze. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes, those cold, calculating blue eyes, hardened into chips of ice. He saw her. He saw the gray uniform, the tray of dirty glasses, the humiliation that was burning on her cheeks. And he enjoyed it. She could see the sick satisfaction dancing in his eyes. He excused himself from the group and, with Veronica clinging to his arm, began to walk towards her. Every instinct screamed at Ilara to flee, but her feet were rooted to the spot. This was her nightmare made flesh. "Well, well," Richard said, his voice low and laced with mock surprise. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent he'd worn when he'd told her he was leaving. "Look what we have here. Ilara, fancy meeting you in a place like this." Veronica let out a tinkling, malicious laugh. "I'll say. I didn't realize Damian Blackwood's standards had dropped so low. You'd think for what he pays he could get better help." She looked Ilara up and down, her lip curled in disgust. "That uniform is just tragic, darling. Gray really isn't your color." Ilara's hands tightened on her tray, her knuckles turning white. She kept her eyes fixed on a point on the floor, praying for it to swallow her whole. "Excuse me?" she muttered, trying to step around them. Richard blocked her path, a smirk playing on his lips. "Not so fast. We were just catching up." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was for her alone. "You know, I always knew you'd end up on your knees cleaning up other people's messes. It's what you're good at." The cruelty was so pure, so potent, it stole her breath. This was the man she had loved, the man she had built a future for in her mind and on her keyboard. He wasn't just content with having taken everything from her. He had to grind the salt into the wound. "Richard, leave the poor thing alone," Veronica said, feigning pity. "She's clearly embarrassed. It's not every day you have to serve champagne to your ex-husband and his beautiful, successful wife at the party of the year." She turned to Ilara, her smile like a razor blade. "Be a dear and get me a fresh glass of champagne, would you? And try not to spill it this time." She deliberately held out her empty glass, positioning it over Ilara's tray of dirty dishes. The implication was clear. She was the trash serving the elite. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, searing poker pressing against her chest. She could feel the eyes of other guests starting to turn towards them, drawn by the small, cruel drama unfolding by the pillar. She had to get away. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she forced herself to look Richard in the eye. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I have work to do." She tried to move again, but Richard's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was like iron. "Not until you get my wife her drink," he hissed, his charming facade momentarily cracking to reveal the monster beneath. "Show some respect." And in that moment, something inside Ilara, something that had been dormant for 2 long years, finally snapped. The humiliation of Richard's touch, the public spectacle, the years of pain, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear fury. Ilara yanked her wrist free from his grasp, the suddenness of the movement causing a few glasses on her tray to clatter precariously. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice low and shaking with a rage she hadn't felt in years. Richard looked momentarily surprised, then amused. "Feisty. I'd forgotten you had that in you. But you're in no position to make demands, are you?" He gestured around the opulent room. "This is my world now, Ilara, not yours. You're just a ghost here." Ilara stared at him, at the handsome, smiling mask that hid a soul rotted by greed. She had to escape. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, her back straight, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't run, but she moved with a desperate speed, heading for the relative sanctuary of the service corridors. She could feel his and Veronica's mocking laughter following her like a physical blow. She found refuge in a small alcove behind the main ballroom where the catering staff had set up their station. Her hands were trembling so violently she had to set her tray down before she dropped it. She leaned against the cool wall, closing her eyes and fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. Crying would be a luxury and indulgence she couldn't afford. Maria would fire her on the spot. After a few minutes of ragged breathing, she composed herself. She had to finish her shift. She had to get paid. She couldn't let him break her, not again. Her next assigned area was the library, a quieter space where guests mingled away from the loud music. Picking up a fresh tray, she steeled herself and pushed back out into the party. The library was magnificent, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves filled with leather-bound books with a spiral staircase leading to a second-level gallery. The air smelled of old paper and brandy. A small group of men was gathered near a large oak desk, their voices low and serious. Ilara moved silently around the room's perimeter, collecting discarded snifters and coasters. As she neared the desk, she recognized one of the men. It was Richard. He was talking to 2 older distinguished gentlemen, the kind of old money investors who could make or break a company with a single phone call. Ilara tried to make herself smaller to blend in with the shadows of a towering bookshelf. She just wanted to grab the empty glasses and leave. But then a few words cut through the air and snagged her attention. "The Thorn Innovations platform is revolutionary." Richard was bragging, puffing out his chest. "But the real genius, the foundational code, is something I acquired years ago. A little project I picked up for a song. It's the engine under the hood of everything we do." One of the investors, a man with a shock of white hair named Mr. Davenport, looked intrigued. "Acquired? I was under the impression you developed it yourself, Thorn." Richard gave a self-deprecating chuckle. A good magician never reveals all his secrets. "Let's just say I have an eye for talent. I found this brilliant raw piece of work, a project codenamed Chimera. And I knew it could change the world. The original creator. Well, let's just say they didn't have the vision to see it through." Ilara's entire world tilted on its axis. Project Chimera. Her name for it. A name she had never told anyone except him. It was a mythological beast made of different parts, just like her algorithm integrated different predictive models into one seamless, powerful whole. The name was her secret, a private joke between her and her creation. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, straining to hear every word, her own breathing seeming deafeningly loud. "So you bought it?" the second investor asked. In a manner of speaking, Richard said evasively. "Then I polished it, perfected it, and packaged it. The first big sale, the one that gave me the seed capital to launch everything else, was to Blackwood Industries. Blackwood himself didn't even know what he was buying, not really. He just saw the potential of the core function. He paid a fortune for a single-use license, and I used that money to build my empire using the more advanced proprietary versions of Chimera that I'd held back." A wave of dizziness washed over Ilara. It all clicked into place. The puzzle pieces of her destruction, scattered and confusing for 2 years, suddenly snapped together to form a single monstrous picture. He hadn't just stolen her reputation in the divorce. He had stolen the work itself long before that. He had taken her life's masterpiece, the product of thousands of hours of her passion and genius, and sold it. He'd sold a piece of it to Damian Blackwood, the very man whose party she was cleaning, and used that money to create the company that he then claimed was his own, leveraging it to leave her with nothing. It wasn't just infidelity. It wasn't just a brutal divorce. It was grand larceny on a soul-crushing scale. He hadn't just broken her heart. He had plundered her mind and sold it for parts. The conversation shifted, but Ilara didn't hear it. A white-hot rage, purer and more potent than anything she had ever experienced, burned away the shock. The shame she had felt just minutes before was gone, replaced by a crystalline, righteous fury. He had called her a ghost. But ghosts can haunt. and she was about to become the most terrifying ghost Richard Thorne had ever seen. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer trembling. They were steady. She placed her tray of glasses on a nearby table with a soft, deliberate click. She took a deep breath. Her 2 years of silence were over. He thought she was invisible. He was about to find out how wrong he was. She stepped out of the shadows. Emerging from the shadows of the bookshelf, Alara felt as though she were walking through water. The ambient noise of the party faded into a dull roar, her focus narrowing to a single point: Richard. He was still holding court, laughing at some joke one of the investors had made, the very picture of a man on top of the world. Her world. She walked directly towards the group, her drab uniform a stark contrast to their bespoke suits. The investors glanced at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and annoyance at the intrusion of a staff member. Richard's smile faltered as he saw her approaching, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Can we help you?" Mr. Davenport asked curtly, clearly dismissing her. Alara ignored him. Her eyes were locked on Richard. "Project Chimera," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the force of a landslide. "That's a very interesting name." Richard's face went rigid. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, unhealthy pallor. He tried to recover, forcing a condescending smile. "I'm sorry, you must be mistaken. The staff aren't meant to engage with the guests." He turned to the investors. "My apologies, gentlemen. An overzealous employee." He tried to wave her away, but Alara stood her ground. "I'm not mistaken, Richard," she said, her voice gaining strength. "You're talking about my work. You're talking about the algorithm I designed, the one I named." A murmur went through the small group. Mr. Davenport and his colleague exchanged a look, their interest piqued. This was no longer a simple interruption. It was a scene. "Alara, you're making a fool of yourself," Richard hissed, his voice a low, threatening growl. He took a step towards her, trying to physically intimidate her, to shepherd her away from his audience. "You're a disgruntled ex-wife who couldn't handle our divorce. Now get back to cleaning the toilets before I have you thrown out." The insult, which would have shattered her an hour ago, now bounced off the armor of her fury. "Disgruntled?" She shot back, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "I was a lot more than your wife. I was your architect. You wouldn't know a line of code from a grocery list. You stood on my shoulders to get where you are, and when you were done, you kicked me off the mountain." The investors were now watching with rapt attention, their brandy snifters forgotten. The drama unfolding before them was far more intoxicating than any alcohol. "This is ridiculous," Richard spluttered, his composure beginning to crack. "She's delusional. The divorce was hard on her." "The divorce was theft," Alara corrected him, her voice ringing with conviction. "You stole my work, sold a piece of it to Damian Blackwood, and used that money to build a company on a foundation of lies. You told these men you acquired it. Tell them how. Tell them how you copied my files from our shared server the night before you told me you wanted a divorce. Tell them how you used my genius and left me to clean your new friends' houses." Just then, drawn by the raised voices, Veronica sauntered over, a fresh glass of champagne in her hand. "Richie, what's going on? Is the help bothering you?" She sized up the situation, her eyes narrowing with venom as she saw Alara at the center of it. "Ah, the new wife," Alara said, turning her attention to Veronica. "The one whose family money paid the lawyers to bury me and my claims. Did he tell you that your entire lifestyle is funded by the work of the woman you're insulting?" Veronica gasped, scandalized. "How dare you? Richard is a genius. You're nothing but a pathetic, jealous woman who couldn't keep her husband." She took a step forward. "You should be grateful we don't sue you for harassment. Now get out of my sight." "I'm not going anywhere," Alara said, her gaze returning to Richard. "I'm done being silent. I'm done being your ghost." The confrontation had created a pocket of silence in the library. More guests were turning to stare, sensing the electric tension. Richard was trapped. His face was a mask of fury and panic. He knew she had original drafts, time-stamped emails, and server logs on old hard drives she'd kept in storage evidence he'd thought she would never be in a position to use. He grabbed her arm again, harder this time. "You're finished," he snarled, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "I will destroy you. I will sue you for slander until you have less than nothing. You will never work again. You'll be homeless. No one will ever believe a little cleaner over Richard Thorne." His fingers dug into her flesh, and for a second a flicker of fear returned. He was powerful. He was ruthless. Maybe he was right. Who would believe her? I believe her. The voice was calm, deep, and carried an undeniable authority that cut through the tension like a razor. It came from the doorway of the library. Every head turned. Leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, was Damian Blackwood. His expression was unreadable, but his gray eyes were fixed on Richard's hand gripping Alara's arm. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The chessboard master had just entered the game. The appearance of Damian Blackwood shifted the very atmosphere of the room. Where there had been a spectacle, there was now a court, and he was the judge. The murmuring ceased instantly. Richard froze, his hand still clamped on Alara's arm, his face a grotesque tableau of shock and fear. He looked like a schoolboy caught setting a fire. Damian pushed himself off the doorframe and began to walk towards them. He moved with a silent, predatory grace, his footsteps making no sound on the plush Persian rug. He didn't look at Richard or the stunned investors. His gaze was fixed entirely on Alara. It was an intense, analytical look, as if he were solving a complex equation. He stopped directly in front of them, creating an impassable barrier between Richard and the rest of the party. The silence was so profound that Alara could hear the frantic thumping of her own heart. "Thorne," Damian said, his voice deceptively mild, "you are a guest in my home. Is there a reason you are manhandling my staff?" Richard immediately released Alara's arm as if it were red hot, taking a step back. He tried to muster his usual charm, but it came out as a desperate, sycophantic stutter. "Mr. Blackwood, Damian, this is a misunderstanding. A private matter. My ex-wife, she's emotionally distressed. I was just trying to calm her down and escort her out before she caused any more of a scene." Damian's eyes didn't leave Alara. He saw the red marks forming on her wrist where Richard's fingers had been. He saw the defiance in her eyes warring with a deep, bone-weary pain. He saw her chin held high even as her body trembled slightly. He saw strength where everyone else saw a victim. Ignoring Richard completely as if he were a piece of furniture, Damian addressed Alara directly. His voice softened, losing its hard corporate edge. "Are you all right?" he asked. Alara was so stunned she could only manage a slight jerky nod. His focused attention was a shield deflecting the hostile stares of everyone else in the room. For the first time all night she felt like a person, not an object of pity or scorn. Veronica, ever the fool, seemed to misinterpret the situation as an opportunity. "Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry," she gushed, stepping forward. "We'll have this woman removed immediately. She has a history of this sort of unhinged behavior." Damian finally flickered his gaze to her, a look of such profound dismissal that Veronica physically flinched. He then looked back at Richard, a cold, dangerous light entering his eyes. "You mentioned that the foundational code for your company was licensed to me years ago. A project called Chimera. An interesting story. I'd like to hear more about it." Panic flared in Richard's eyes. This was a nightmare. His lie, the one that had built his fortune, was now being scrutinized by the most powerful man in the room, the one man who could verify or destroy it with a single word. "It's a complex business matter," Richard stammered, sweating under the weight of Damian's stare. "Perhaps we can discuss it another time." He gestured dismissively at Alara. "This is hardly the place. She is clearly unwell." He made his final fatal mistake. In his desperation, he tried to cast Alara as the crazy, hysterical woman one last time, a thing to be discarded so the important men could talk. Damian observed the entire scene, the cowering, lying thief, the venomous, social-climbing wife, and the woman in the drab gray uniform who stood her ground against them both, armed with nothing but the truth. He saw the whole story laid bare. He turned his full attention back to Alara, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. The air crackled with anticipation. Everyone leaned in, waiting for him to deliver the final verdict to cast the cleaning woman out and restore order to his perfect party. Instead, he did something no one could have ever predicted. In a deliberate formal gesture that seemed to come from another century, Damien Blackwood reached out and gently took Alara's hand, not her wrist, but her hand holding it as if it were something precious. He lifted it, his touch surprisingly warm, and bowed his head slightly. He looked up, meeting her shocked, sapphire-blue eyes. In a voice that was clear, firm, and carried to every corner of the now silent room, he made a declaration that would echo through New York's elite for months to come. "Are you all right?" he asked again, his voice resonating with a new profound meaning. "My queen." The shockwave was instantaneous and absolute. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Richard Thorne's jaw dropped, his face turning the color of ash. Veronica looked as if she'd been slapped. My queen. 2 words. A pet name. A code. A public coronation. No one knew, but the meaning was unmistakable. This was not a staff member. This was not a crazy ex-wife. This was someone under the direct, formidable protection of Damien Blackwood. He had not just entered the game. He had overturned the entire board. With those 2 words still hanging in the air like resonant chimes, Damien kept his gentle hold on Alara's hand. He turned his back to the stunned and gaping faces of Richard and Veronica and began to lead Alara away from the library. The crowd of onlookers parted for them as if the Red Sea, their whispers following like the rustle of leaves. Alara was in a state of profound shock. Her mind, usually so quick and logical, was a maelstrom of confusion. My queen. The phrase made no sense. It was absurd theatrical. Yet the way he'd said it with such calm and deliberate intent had felt like a shield being raised around her. She allowed herself to be led, her cheap, rubber-soled shoes silent next to the confident click of his expensive Italian leather ones. He didn't take her to the service corridors or the exit. Instead, he led her to a discreet door she hadn't noticed before, pressed his thumb to a biometric scanner, and ushered her inside his private study. The door clicked shut, sealing them off from the noise and drama of the party. The study was the antithesis of the ostentatious penthouse. It was a space of quiet, functional minimalism. One wall was a screen displaying fluctuating market data. Another held shelves filled not with decorative books, but with technical manuals, engineering texts, and philosophical treatises. The only piece of art was a large, complex, abstract painting that reminded Alara of a circuit board. Damien released her hand and gestured to one of 2 leather armchairs facing a sleek, dark wood desk. "Please," he said. Alara sank into the chair, the supple leather a world away from her cramped studio apartment's lumpy sofa. Damien walked over to a small concealed bar, retrieving a bottle of water. He opened it and handed it to her before pouring a glass of what looked like whiskey for himself. He didn't sit behind his desk in a position of power, but took the other armchair so they were facing each other as equals. For a long moment he was silent, simply studying her with those piercing gray eyes. Alara's confusion began to give way to suspicion. This was a billionaire. Billionaires didn't act out of chivalry. They acted out of strategy. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice raspy. "Why did you do that? What was my queen?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Damien's lips. "It was a gambit," he said. "A move intended to provoke a reaction and seize control of the board. And it seemed appropriate. You were surrounded, outnumbered, yet you refused to surrender your position. That has a certain royalty to it." His explanation was as logical and unsentimental as his surroundings. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a tactical maneuver. Strangely, that made Alara trust him more. "You heard him," she stated, not a question. "In the library." "I heard enough," Damien confirmed. "I was in the gallery above on the spiral staircase. I heard him mention Chimera and the sale to my company. I also have a healthy distrust of Richard Thorne." His rise has always seemed too fast, too hollow. I suspected he was a fraud. I just didn't have the proof." He took a sip of his whiskey. "Until his architect showed up in my library. It was all business. He was protecting his assets, investigating a potential fraud that involved his own company. Her public humiliation had simply been a convenient catalyst. I need you to tell me everything," he said, his tone shifting from analytical to serious. "From the beginning. Every detail about Project Chimera, every promise Richard made, every line of code you wrote, every document you might still have." Hesitation warred with a desperate need to finally be heard. For 2 years she had been screaming into a void. Now the one person who could actually do something was asking to listen. Still, a deep-seated mistrust held her back. She had trusted one powerful, charming man before, and it had destroyed her. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice laced with the bitterness of her experience. "What's in it for you? You're a billionaire. Your company is built on my work. You could just as easily bury me to hide that fact." Damien met her gaze without flinching. "That's a fair question," he conceded. "First, what's in it for me? Justice and order. I don't tolerate thieves in my ecosystem. Thorne built his company on a fraudulent asset sale to me. That makes him a liability I need to neutralize. His company is a direct competitor, and knowing that its foundation is rotten gives me a significant advantage." He leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "Second, and more importantly, what's in it for you? I'm not offering you pity, Ms. Vance. I'm offering you a partnership. You have the truth, the evidence, and the intellect that created Chimera. I have the resources, the legal power, and the public platform to make that truth heard. Together we can dismantle Richard Thorne's empire piece by piece." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Help me ruin him," he said, his voice dropping to a low, compelling pitch. "And I will give you back everything he stole from you. Your name, your reputation, and your rightful stake in the technology you created. He left you with nothing. I'm offering you the chance to own everything." It was a staggering proposal. Not a handout, but an alliance. He wasn't saving a damsel in distress. He was recruiting a general for a war. He saw her not as a cleaner or a victim, but as a valuable asset and equal. The architect. For the first time in 2 years, a flicker of the old Alara, the ambitious, brilliant, confident woman she used to be, ignited within her. The ghost in the machine was finally being seen. She looked at this enigmatic, powerful man who spoke of justice and strategy in the same breath. It was a risk, a massive, terrifying risk. But the alternative was to fade back into the shadows, to spend the rest of her life cleaning up other people's messes, while the man who ruined her thrived. She took a slow sip of water, her hand steady now. She met his gaze, and for the first time he saw not a trace of the victim in her eyes, only the cool, calculating fire of a master strategist. "All right, Mr. Blackwood," Alara Vance said. "Let's go to war." The days that followed were a surreal whirlwind. Alara walked out of Damien Blackwood's penthouse not as a cleaner, but as his clandestine partner. One of his security details drove her home in a sleek black Audi, a silent guard against any potential fallout from Richard. The next morning a car was waiting for her again. It didn't take her to a cleaning job. It took her to a luxury residential hotel where a suite had been arranged for her under a pseudonym. "You need a secure location to work," Damien had explained over a secure phone line. "A clean environment free from distraction and potential surveillance. Thorne is predictable. When he feels threatened, he'll lash out. He'll try to intimidate you." He was right. Within 48 hours, she received a cease and desist letter from Richard's lawyers accusing her of slander and threatening a multi-million-dollar lawsuit. A few days later, a sleazy article appeared in a gossip blog painting her as a mentally unstable stalker obsessed with her ex-husband. It was Richard's classic playbook attack: discredit and bury. But this time it was different. She wasn't alone. Alara forwarded the legal threats to Damien's legal team, a veritable army of the sharpest corporate lawyers in New York. They responded with a countersuit so aggressive and meticulously detailed that Richard's lawyers went completely silent. When the gossip blog posted its story, Damien's PR team had it taken down within an hour, citing defamation, and started a quiet but effective counter-narrative seeding whispers in the financial press about an upcoming major intellectual property dispute that could rock Thorne Innovations to its core. For Ilara, it was like watching a master tactician at work. While she had been fighting a guerrilla war with a pocket knife, Damien commanded an arsenal of tanks and air support. They worked relentlessly. Damien set up a war room in a secure office floor at Blackwood Industries. Ilara, dressed not in a uniform but in business attire provided for her, finally felt like herself again. Surrounded by whiteboards and smart screens, she began to meticulously reconstruct her work. She dug her old hard drives out of a storage unit in Queens, relics of her past life she could never bring herself to throw away. On them she found everything early drafts of the Chimera Code, time-stamped with creation dates years before Richard claimed he acquired it. Email chains between her and Richard, where she explained the complex nuances of the algorithm to him, essentially tutoring the man who would later claim her work. Server logs showing the exact date and time he had copied her entire project folder the night before he ended their marriage. It was the smoking gun. Damien was a demanding but brilliant partner. He wasn't a coder on her level, but his understanding of systems and strategy was unparalleled. He would listen for hours as she explained the intricacies of her algorithm, asking incisive questions that pushed her to articulate her genius in ways she hadn't in years. He didn't just see the code, he saw its beauty, its elegance, its power. This recursive learning loop, he said one evening, pointing at a projection of her work on the wall. It's not just functional, it's art. He didn't just steal a product, he stole a masterpiece. In those moments, sharing a late-night meal of takeout sushi over schematics and legal documents, the dynamic between them began to shift. The alliance born of mutual interest started to feel like a true partnership. She discovered a side of Damien Blackwood the world never saw. Beneath the ruthless billionaire was a man who appreciated intellect, who despised bullies, and who possessed a dry, unexpected wit. She, in turn, started to shed the shell of the victim she had been forced into. The old Ilara, passionate, sharp, and fiercely intelligent, re-emerged. One night, exhausted after a 12-hour session with the lawyers, Ilara was staring out the window of the war room, watching the city lights twinkle below. "You miss it, don't you?" Damien said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "What? The work," he said. "The creating. You're not a victim, Ilara. You're a builder. He tried to turn you into a ghost, but he failed." She looked at him, at his strong profile silhouetted against the city skyline. "For 2 years I thought he'd succeeded," she admitted, her voice soft. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said, turning to face her. "You had the strength all along. You just needed the right leverage." His gaze was intense, and for the first time it felt less like a business partner analyzing an asset, and more like a man seeing a woman he truly admired. The space between them crackled with an unspoken energy, a different kind of alliance taking shape in the quiet of the night. Meanwhile, their offensive was working. Thorne Innovations' stock began to wobble. Investors grew nervous. The whispers of IP theft became louder. Richard, trapped and increasingly desperate, began making mistakes. He issued public denials that were clumsy and easily disproven. He tried to launch a smear campaign against Damien, an idiotic move that was like a mouse roaring at a lion. The final piece of their strategy fell into place when Damien's investigators found the former colleague Richard had paid off to lie during the divorce proceedings. Faced with irrefutable evidence of perjury and the threat of federal charges, the man cracked. He signed a sworn affidavit detailing exactly how Richard had orchestrated the entire fraud. They had him. All the pieces were in place. It was time for checkmate. The stage for the final act was the annual Blackwood Industries Tech Summit, a major industry event attended by investors, analysts, and the most influential figures in the tech world. It was broadcast live on financial news networks. Richard Thorne was a scheduled speaker, a slot he couldn't back out of without raising even more suspicion. It was the perfect public arena for his downfall. Alara watched from the wings of the stage, standing beside Damien. She was no longer in a cleaner's uniform or a borrowed business suit. She wore a tailored deep blue dress, the color of power. The color of her eyes and her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked every bit the tech visionary she was. On the surface she was calm, but inside her heart was a hummingbird's wings. "Nervous?" Damien asked, his voice a low murmur beside her. "Terrified," she admitted, "and exhilarated." He gave her a rare, genuine smile. "Good. That means you're ready." Richard took the stage to polite but noticeably reserved applause. The rumors had taken their toll. He looked gaunt, his usual confident swagger replaced by a brittle arrogance. He launched into his presentation about the future of AI, using slides that were ironically powered by the very logic Alara had designed. He was halfway through his speech when Damien gave their tech team the signal. The large screen behind Richard flickered. His presentation vanished, replaced by a single damning document, the time-stamped server log showing the file transfer of Project Chimera from Alara's directory to his. A collective gasp went through the auditorium. Richard stopped mid-sentence, staring in horror at the screen. "There seems to be a technical difficulty," he stammered, his voice cracking. The screen changed again. An email from Alara to Richard dated 3 years prior. In it she wrote, "And that's the core of Chimera, Richie. It's not just predictive, it's intuitive. It's my baby." The screen flickered again. The signed affidavit from the colleague who had committed perjury. Then another and another. Piece by piece, the architecture of Richard's lies was laid bare for the entire world to see. The audience was silent, utterly captivated by the systematic, digital execution taking place before their eyes. Richard was hyperventilating, his face slick with sweat. He fumbled for his water, knocking over the glass. His empire was crumbling in real time. At that moment, Damien Blackwood walked onto the stage, a microphone in his hand. He walked to the center, his presence commanding absolute attention. "My apologies for the interruption," he said, his voice calm and clear. "We at Blackwood Industries believe in transparency and intellectual honesty. It has come to our attention that Thorne Innovations was founded upon a lie." He turned to the audience. "The true architect behind the technology that launched Mr. Thorne's company is here with us today. She is the mind that created Chimera, the genius whose work was stolen. It is my honor to correct the record and introduce you to the real innovator." He turned and extended his hand towards the wings, towards her. Taking a deep breath, Alara walked out into the bright, unforgiving lights of the stage. She walked past a catatonic Richard Thorne and stood beside Damien. She didn't look at her ex-husband. He no longer mattered. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the cameras broadcasting her image to the world. "My name is Alara Vance," she said, her voice steady and strong, "and I'm ready to take back what's mine." The auditorium erupted in applause, a deafening roar of vindication. Later that evening, long after the news had broken and Richard Thorne's name had become synonymous with fraud, Alara stood with Damien on the west terrace of his penthouse, the same terrace she had cleaned just weeks before. "It's over," she said, the words feeling both monumental and inadequate. "It's a beginning," he corrected her. He had a new company to launch with her as his co-founder and chief technology officer. Her name was cleared, her future brighter than she had ever dared to imagine. She looked at him, the man who had given her the weapons to fight her war. "I still don't fully understand," she said. "That night. Why my queen?" "It was a tactic, I know, but it felt like more." Damien stepped closer, his gray eyes searching hers in the soft light of the city. "At first it was a tactic," he admitted. "A way to claim you for my side of the board. But when I saw you in that library, cornered and attacked, refusing to break, I saw a woman with more integrity and strength in her little finger than men like Thorne have in their entire bodies. Royalty isn't about bloodlines or crowns, Alara. It's about sovereignty over oneself. And in your darkest moment, you were more sovereign than anyone I had ever met." He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. The alliance had run its course. The war was won. And in its place something new and far more profound was beginning to grow. "He called you a ghost," Damien said softly. But he was wrong. He leaned in, his voice a whisper against her ear. "You were always the queen." Alara's journey wasn't just about getting revenge, it was about reclaiming her voice, her power, and her identity. She went from being an invisible ghost cleaning up the messes of a life that was stolen from her to the queen of her own destiny, standing in the spotlight she had earned. Her story is a powerful reminder that no one can steal your true worth. Even when you're at your lowest, cornered and outnumbered, the strength to rebuild your kingdom lies within you. Sometimes all it takes is one person to see you for who you truly are, and for you to have the courage to fight back. If Alara's story of triumph moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more dramatic real-life stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for watching.